Data lies. Well, it doesn't actually lie, but sometimes we get fooled, and Rule 13 helps us avoid that. So Rule 13 became real to me from a business context. That's really where I learned it, but I probably first saw it in a statistics textbook back in college. Rule 13 says correlation does not mean causation. And the textbook might put it as correlation does not imply causation. But a lot of times we want to come up with an answer. And so we'll look for these correlations and say, aha. Or worse yet, we come up with a theory. We think we know the answer. Look for some data. We see a correlation and say, aha, this proves that I am correct. One of my favorite examples in this scenario is as ice cream consumption increases, drownings increase. And therefore, ice cream consumption causes drowning. Now, we know that's ridiculous, but it's an example of the logic we use to take correlation and say that has to be causation. So mathematically, we look at correlation as a measure of the relationship between variables. And we most often look at this with the correlation coefficient, which ranges from -1 to 1 and measures how linearly related the variables are. So as we approach +1, that means as one variable changes, the other variable increases or changes in the same way. Whereas we approach -1 on that scale, as one variable changes, the other one changes in the opposite direction. And so as we move towards 0, away from either -1 or +1, that means there isn't a correlation or a strong correlation. So there are various reasons why correlation and causation break down. One of the easiest explanations for that is just coincidence, happenstance, luck. And I found a cool website that looks at these strong correlations that just happen to be that way. One of my favorite involves astronomy and crime. So this guy looked at the distance between the planets Earth and Neptune, because that changes as the two planets move around the sun, and also crime, particularly burglaries in the state of Kansas, and the strong correlation between distance between the planets and burglaries in Kansas. So you want to watch out for that. Now, I'll put a link in the description down below for that website if you want to check out some of the other fun ones there. So the second reason there can be a breakdown in correlation and causation is that you have things reversed, or reverse causality. So this idea that there's a cause and effect, sometimes the effect is really the cause of the cause, if that made sense. So it could be a scenario where research shows that consumption of diet soda leads to obesity. And some data you would look at kind of implies that, but we know Rule 13, because if we look closer at it, we realize that it's really obesity drives the consumption of diet soda. Another one similar to that is the relationship where body mass index, so BMI, as that increases, depression occurs. Now, when you dig into that and look at it from a time perspective and some other control factors, what you really find is that depression tends to drive up BMI. And so we want to be careful about those reverse causalities. And the third one that we'll talk about is confounding variables. That is the idea that there's another variable that we may or may not have measured that really drives the cause, or is the cause. So back to my example of consumption of ice cream and drowning. Well, what about the variable, the temperature, right, or the season? So that's really what's driving those two things independently. It's not that ice cream consumption and drowning is connected. And so we want to look for those, what people will call confounders in the data, looking at more of what we measure. Now, often we don't want to do that, right? Because we find data that supports our belief or our theory or our worldview, and we stop there. But we often need to ask ourselves the question of, are there confounding variables there that I'm not looking at? That's why sometimes you'll catch me in social political discussions where a strong opinion is being exercised. I will simply say, I think it's more complex or complicated than that. What else do we need to look at? If you're wondering where I am today, I'm at Anderson Hill State Forest here in the town of Richford, part of Tioga County. and a cool state forest here. No real maintained trails, but as you saw, we were on that service road, about a mile and a half of that, but a lot of acres to explore here. And as I was walking along, I happened to see behind me here this kind of marshy area. All that green caught my eye. You know, here in April, we're not quite budded out yet. So I don't know what all those plants are yet. We'll take a look and try to figure that out. If you know, put it in the comments below. But this region here at one time was farmed by the early settlers, a lot of the folks coming out of the Revolutionary War, but didn't do real well, moved on. New York State would end up buying the land over time. And in 1939 to 1940, the Civilian Conservation Corps came in and planted over 60,000 trees by hand. New York Conservation would plant more trees later on. And so kind of a nice mixture here of hardwoods and then softer woods and conifers and deciduous. But a cool little place to check out sometime. So what does all this mean? Well, I'm still a big fan of looking at correlation. I would often use that in problem determination for computer systems. It's a great place to narrow down, divide and conquer thousands of variables to, well, let's look at what correlates first and dig at that. I think that's helpful. But like I said, we have to be careful that we're not stopping or looking at things from a worldview perspective. What's the weirdest correlation causation story you've heard? Or what's a scenario where you were led down one path because of correlation, but then you found a new variable or new information, maybe a confounder that led you to a different answer? I'd love to hear about those scenarios, and we can talk about them in the comments down below. In any case, I really do appreciate you all being here, coming along. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and we'll talk again soon. Bye now.